Okay, so as discussed, I'm going to deliver to you a piece of writing that's already complete. It's by a Dr. James Lindsay, and I found it very interesting. It's lengthy, but it's worth it. And it speaks about the cult dynamics of wokeness. And I'll go on to do further streams of how Christians are converting into this cult, basically. So now we're going to just look at some elements of this indoctrination. So cult indoctrinations tend to follow very predictable stages. Firstly, there's initiation, then indoctrination, and then reprogramming. And these three phases are distinct and they must be understood in their own terms. So cult initiation. Okay. Cult doctrine, including extreme fundamentalist interpretations of religious doctrines as cultish, exists generally to resolve a particularly powerful emotional vulnerability in an unhealthy way. This adds another layer of defense for responsible faith, which does so in a healthy way to the degree that it does the same thing, i.e. resolves emotional issues. So the question is where that emotional vulnerability comes from, because with cults, it's always exploited. Sometimes the underlying emotional vulnerability is there for personal reasons or as a result of life events. People turn to various doctrines to explain and contextualize the major events in their lives or to understand who they are. Again, this can be healthy or unhealthy. Vulnerability is also often deliberately inflamed or manufactured for the purpose of doing occult initiation. However, especially in unhealthy cases, would-be indoctrinators ask manipulative questions and try to catch people on the spot in a feeling of discomfort that is usually rooted in their morality and sense of being a good or adequate person. So with religions in general, obviously, many of these vulnerabilities are evoked by asking about one's fears of death. And these leave much room for manipulation by more cultish sects. With religious cults, as we're using the term, however, they can also center directly on making their mark feel morally deficient or unacceptable. And that is the case in healthy as well as unhealthy conversations about religion, i.e. you would ask someone, do you know you're a sinner? And that can be used, what's the word I'm looking for? That can be used in without an altruistic end. So, and did you know you're complicit in racist systems is obviously another, it's another example. So once this vulnerability has been successfully manufactured in the mark, the person that you're seeking to indoctrinate or initiate, or identified and inflamed if it's already present, cult doctrine is given as a potential resolution to the emotional distress. So in short, you give them the bad news, as it were, you get the emotional vulnerability exposed, and then you manipulate it by seeking then to provide an answer to, you know, the complicity within the racist systems as given in the example. So be an anti-racist, help us dismantle the systems, build a better world, etc. And we can note that this can occur in a healthy context or an unhealthy one. And these can sometimes be difficult, actually, to distinguish from one another. The cult application will always be unhealthy in the end, and it can be known by the further manipulation that it uses. It must be understood that this is merely the initiation, either to a religious or moral conversion or to a cult, in which case the word initiation resonates more strongly. Once the doctrine is initially accepted by the cult's mark, the next step is to make the mark feel morally welcome and good. The goal is to give them resolution to the vulnerable and dissonant emotional state that was utilized previously, that bring them down to lift them up again. The mark will be made to feel like they're now doing the right thing where they were doing the wrong thing before. This can still be done in healthy ways, and almost all genuine interventions proceed in this manner. Cults don't diverge from religions and other moral systems at the outset, or they'd never get any marks to convert. For example, of the relevant kind of language, however, consider this. You can be one of the saved and forgiven, as one example, and you're on the right side of history as another. So once the person feels morally welcome and the feeling of vulnerability gets its first hit of calming resolution through the doctrine, the cult indoctrinator will start to increase the depths of the doctrine, usually a little at a time. With a cult, this will involve beginning to teach the quieter parts of the cult worldview that would scare off potential new recruits. And this is where we can find the first clear sign that we are dealing with a cult rather than something healthier, though there's still some overlap and ambiguity. They will deepen the doctrine while informing their mark that they'll be surrounded by temptation, especially from broader society. This gets us the surest first sign that a cult initiation is taking place, though. It's when this warning starts being applied to friends and family who will be described as failing to understand the depth and the value of the cult's doctrine. In fact, that's a clear indicator. Another clear sign that one is dealing with occult indoctrination rather than something healthier is making the mark live up to contradictory demands. So you must understand racism, and you must admit that you cannot understand racism. You must admit to your complicity in racism and pledge to do better, knowing that it's impossible to do better. You must be an ally, but accept that you will always do your allyship wrong. Impossible demands would scare off a potential cult initiate at the beginning, but once a sufficient level of commitment to the cause has taken hold and taken place, the effect is the opposite in actual fact. Rather than making the mark reject the cult, these impossible and paradoxical demands dramatically deepen commitment to the cult. They do this by re-invoking and massively inflaming the feeling of vulnerability at the core, making the mark burn with a desire to do better, to resolve the emotional dissonance and the white-hot feeling of inadequacy as judged against the cult's impossible standards. Outsiders see through this emotionally abusive tactic immediately. Cult initiates see it as a kind of ritual hazing and demand to prove the faith, very much like an abused child or spouse always trying to do better to live up to the unmet demands of their abuser. The concept of white fragility in the anti-racist woke cult is exactly this kind of emotional shakedown. White fragility separates white people and their adjacencies into exactly two types. So there are racists who admit it and racists who are too emotionally fragile to admit it. You notice there's no scope for non-racists. It's obvious which side the cult doctrine favors. In fact, the cult doctrine is, in this case, is that every white person and white adjacent person is a racist by default. And there are only those with the moral and emotional fortitude to face that, which is good according to the doctrine, and those who lack the necessary moral fibre. So every reaction to a person accused of racism or white fragility itself is proof of this moral failure and the need to do better, unless it is a full-on assent to the cult doctrine, including a promise to consume more of it, change yourself accordingly, do the work it demands, and to do better anyway. White fragility as a concept is explicitly a cult indoctrination technique into the anti-racist cult. Speaking more generally, this is all a process that evolves over time, and when dealing with a cult, it's a largely willful move to bring the mark further into the cult while separating them from other social, emotional, and personal ties. So depending on the degree of vulnerability generated at the outset, if you remember, this process can go quite quickly, taking only a few weeks, although months is more common. The process is summarized as such. Lead the mark to take a step further in. Coach them into rationalizing why that step was good, and then repeat with a further step. Every step in means more investment into the cult and a harder path back out again. Meanwhile, separating the mark from trust in outside influences becomes increasingly necessary. So those might cause the mark to doubt their new faith position while it's still shaky, which would prevent their full submission to the cult ideology. At this early phase in cult indoctrination, where initiation is effectively complete, but indoctrination hasn't fully begun, the mark hasn't devoted enough of themselves to the cause to be fully committed yet. So cult indoctrination. Thus, the next step in cult indoctrination is to get people more fully committed. This is actually rather easy, as we tend to commit to new groups fairly quickly under certain well-known conditions. Usual cult deepening methods include public pronouncements of faith before the in-group community, which bonds the mark to them socially and emotionally. This will often involve rituals such as group prayers or singing or outright initiation rituals, which dramatically deepen commitment to a group very quickly. There will also be requests to make costly personal sacrifices to be considered a full part of the new group. This can also include requests for money, cutting ties with relations and family, making pledges, doing the work, and more, including in many cults of personality, allowing the cult leader to have sex with the marks of the desired sexes. So making sacrifice and working on behalf of a group, including a cult, creates deep ties of commitment to the group, its mission, its community also, and it evokes the sunk cost fallacy mechanism, which prevents people from leaving. The fallacy is a reasoning error that basically says, I've invested so much already that it must be worth it, so I'll keep going. It keeps people committed to failing projects, failing relationships, and as it happens, cults, long after they should have abandoned them. And so we hit a particular and important point here. When people like the critical whiteness educator, who knew, Robin DiAngelo, tell us things like anti-racism is a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism, she is providing a mid-level cult indoctrination path. The demand is to change yourself for life in alignment with the cult's doctrine, including how you think, how you see yourself, and how you operate within the world, and make that change a permanent part of who you are. Notice that it also demands you do the work on behalf of the cult and its objectives, which ties you more tightly to it. This process progresses over time, usually months, demanding more costly sacrifices, costly signals, and doing work for the cult and its doctrinal mission. Costly sacrifices and signals are particularly powerful displays of commitment. And when the mark rationalizes these objectively bad decisions and the cognitive dissonance that that doing them causes, they nearly always rationalize themselves much further into the cult. And these demands must be made fairly, slowly and carefully, and they're meant to increase emotional investment and commitment. One thing that the cult of wokeness is doing wrong is suddenly demanding too much too fast, partly because it can, and partly because it's trying to do so universally, as we see, rather than in personal one-on-one settings. And this push is breaking the spell for many people, thank God, who would otherwise have been going along and seduced further into this cult. And this may hopefully result in its downfall. At this point, cult indoctrination begins in earnest, and the mark will be urged to consume more doctrine, possibly in immersive quantities. It will be expected to be consumed uncritically, that's very important, looking only for areas of agreement and assent, which are then reaffirmed in the mark by other members of the cult and within the leadership. With the woke cult, the immense and widespread push to get people reading anti-racist and other woke literature in mass quantities right now is consistent with this step. These include the following currently best-selling books, among many others: White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. When the mark is sufficiently committed to begin uncritically, that's very important, without critique, without asking questions, when they're ready to begin consuming massive quantities of this cult doctrine, they're well into the indoctrination phase. So simultaneously, to prevent critical interpretations of the cult doctrine and ensure full effective immersion in the cult community, marks will be urged to cut ties with the outside voices of reason and dissenting opinions. So broader society itself will now be construed by the cult as bad, evil, complicit, depraved, and any number of other terrible things that the cult's doctrine is adamantly against, e.g. Systemically racist, that kind of stuff. The mark will thus be encouraged to segregate from broader society as much as possible, even possibly becoming hostile to its potential intrusions. And this will eventually include encouraging cutting ties with family and friends who remain outside of the cult, which at this stage is fairly easy to achieve because the indoctrinated convert is almost insufferable to be around anyway at this stage. Before long, the cultist will convince the mark that every voice that disagrees with the cult is somehow demonic and out to pull the mark away from the cult. And this is relatively hard during the cult initiation phase, during which the increasingly sunk cost of participation is mostly what keeps the mark in. But it becomes very easy once the mark is taught to see it, meaning the way the outsiders try to get them away from the cult for bad reasons, as the cult defines them, at which point they lose all trust in outsiders. Once the cultist starts to turn on outsiders as though they are bad influences, only trying to pull people out of the cult, it's extremely difficult to get them to change course. They are more or less indoctrinated by that point, completely and utterly, and very stuck. And then the project changes completely. And with indoctrination complete, the cult reprogramming phase begins now in earnest. And as an aside, before I finish this section, of course, these phases do have a lot of overlap and can be, quite fuzzy, but the descriptions and the progression largely holds.